Welcome to the Cybersecurity Matters podcast. Your hosts today are me, Harry Baldwin, and Matt Rose, two members of the neuco cyber team, and we're delighted to be joined today by CEO of FusionAuth, Brian Bell. Brian has spent over 20 years building and scaling enterprise software companies, leading growth through IPOs, private equity deals, and strategic acquisitions. Before joining FusionAuth, Brian served as CEO of Split, where he led the company through its acquisition by Harness. Prior to that, he was CMO of Ping Identity and also held executive leadership roles at Zuora and CA Technologies. Today, as CEO of FusionAuth, Brian is focused on redefining how developers approach customer identity and access management. Welcome to the show, Brian. It's great to have you on.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. To start things off, we always start with the same first question. How did you first get into the cybersecurity industry?
Great, yeah. Well, for me, I really came into cybersecurity through the identity side of the world, right? I was first exposed to identity really way back at CA Technologies. They had acquired a few companies that were in the workforce identity space, and I was running initially solution and product marketing. I ended up becoming a general manager in a different part of the business, but first got exposed to identity there, and then of course at Ping Identity, and now at FusionAuth. So really my introduction into cybersecurity is through that world of identity. And I think what really excites me about the world of identity is just that it's this unique intersection of security, but also user experience and business growth. And that's a little different than, other parts of cybersecurity where it may not touch the user experience, or it might touch it in a negative way versus try to make it a positive experience. And it doesn't have a direct impact on business growth. I mean, in the world of identity, if users can't securely and seamlessly log in, nothing else in the digital experience really works, right? Revenue stops, trust breaks down, customers leave. And that's really what excited me about the world of identity. The other thing I think that excited me about the world of identity and my introduction to cybersecurity is just the way that identity has evolved over the years, right? Just watching it evolve from being what really was early on when I first got exposed to it, kind of a back office IT utility that was run by, an IT function. And it wasn't really viewed as a mission critical infrastructure the way it is today, right? It is viewed absolutely as critical infrastructure for every digital business, and because it's involved in every customer interaction, whether it's mobile apps or AI agents or commerce, streaming, banking, gaming, and the stakes are much, much higher than they were, 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, no, very interesting. Were you passionate about IT, identity, and computers when you were younger, or were you much interested in something else?
I was always interested in different things. One thing I think that has been a constant in my life and probably has driven a lot of my career decisions was this desire to always be kind of at the forefront of change, which did not necessarily mean technology. Very early on in my career coming out of university, I was a Japanese language major, and I was fascinated at the time by Japan. This is like, way back when Japan was really redefining how business worked, how processes worked. And I was drawn to just new ideas. And whether that was technology or, processing, the way process works, the way organizations are structured, the way decisions get made, anything that was really disrupting, the old way of doing things. That's really been what's driven me, even more so than just technology per se. My
Yeah.
fascination with technology is obviously related to that because technology is constantly disrupting and changing, how we live, how we work, how the world's evolving.
Yeah, absolutely. Go on, Matt. I know you've got
Yeah,
some questions about career.
looking back on your career, is there anything that stands out, anything or any person along the way that stands out as a really big influence on your journey?
Yeah, I've thought about this, many times, and I really can't point to one person in particular. I mean, it really has been many, many people in my career that have influenced me. I've worked with some great leaders, some great mentors. I'm lucky to have worked with a lot of founders and operators, including here at FusionAuth. There's a founder. I was not the founder. I was brought in as a CEO. And I've always been fascinated by founders and the way they're able to, really build these businesses from nothing. And I've learned a lot about growing a business, with humility and with conviction from the people I've worked with. I would say, the things that have really influenced me in my career have been just the experiences I've had. And, you can kind of look back at all of the opportunities one's been given and realize what you've taken away from it. And I think that's absolutely true, and sometimes what we take away from an experience is not necessarily a positive thing, but it's often a learning. And if I were to point to a few things, I would say it was the different experiences I had professionally early on, which were not even in tech. I mentioned, I was a Japanese language major coming out of university, and I worked in Japan for a while. But I was working for a consumer products company. It was a Japanese consumer products company that, kind of like a Unilever, Procter and Gamble, a big player in Asia. And, there, what I took away the importance of customer feedback, right? Both qualitative, quantitative feedback on how do you market products. That's one one influence on my career very, very early on, the importance of really listening to customers, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And then moving on, I worked at a big, strategy consulting company called BCG. There, I think I really just learned how to think strategically, how to think rationally, how to think about markets, how do you think about competitive moats, all of those bigger strategic questions. And then, in other things that strike me are an experience at Zora, which was a category defining player, and the importance of just storytelling, the ability to actually communicate how the world has changed and how a new technology can really address the problems that you're experiencing as the world changes. And then, of course, just in the last, I don't know, decade or so, being a CEO, I've just learned all kinds of things, and really more than all those things I learned early on. I think what I've learned as a CEO of a couple of businesses now is that culture and execution compound over time much more than strategy does. And while strategy is important, and of course data and listening to customers are all super important and foundational, it's really the culture and the execution that matters most. And that's what I've learned from my experience in the last couple CEO opportunities.
And you mentioned the kind of importance of the influence of leaders that you've worked with across your career. How has that shaped your own approach to leadership in your kind of leadership positions?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, we evolve quite a lot as leaders, I think, as you evolve. And I think the things that have influenced me is really those leaders who view their role as, particularly CEOs, right, who view their role as building an executive team that is really empowered and high performing, right? That is really the most important part of the role. I mean, yes, you're doing other things as CEO. You're influencing the board. You're raising money. You're obviously thinking longer term. You're thinking a little bit ahead of maybe where most of the company is and where we need to be going. But one of the most important things is hiring a team, aligning that team, and creating what I call Team One, right? Which is this leadership team that is really the team that is going to make this business successful or not. And I've learned that through, I guess, of just observing, leaders who have done it really, really well, who, you guys have, I'm sure, seen and interact with people like this that are just incredible at that. And then I've also learned by observing leaders who have not been able to do it well, and just the dysfunction that can create. And, and while it might feel like it's working in some ways, in the long run, it doesn't work if you don't have a team that's really, producing and aligned and performing at a high level.
And across your career, you've had a lot of achievements, but is there one that particularly stands out as the one you're most proud of?
Yeah, God, there's many things I guess that I'm proud of in my career. Some of them are defining new categories. In some of the companies I've been at, some of it's been just building new marketing teams from scratch and making them high performing teams. I would go back to kind of what I just said though, which is that the things that I'm most proud of is where I have been able to build and scale teams that genuinely enjoy working together while still performing at a high level. When you really look back, I love asking this question to new leaders, which is think back to a time when you were part of a team that not only was performing well, but you really enjoyed it, and that's magical. It doesn't happen often, and I've been able to do that fortunately in a few places. Going back to my time at CA when I was a general manager of a business unit, the marketing teams I had at Zora and at Ping Identity, and then the leadership teams at Split and now FusionAuth, and that those are really the achievements that I'm most proud of, is that ability to build these teams that are just crushing it and enjoying each other and the journey as much as the outcome that we're producing.
What was the experience leading Split to acquisition by Harness like? Was there anything that you took away from that process?
Yeah, a lot more gray hair. No, I would say, acquisitions are intense, right? I mean, and they're intense for a few reasons. One, of course, there's a lot that goes on with an acquisition. I mean, if you have bankers involved, there's a lot of stakeholders just in the process that you're not normally interacting with, not just the bankers, but attorneys, on multiple sides. But the more intense thing I think is just because you're balancing the interest of multiple stakeholders, right? You have, of course, your customers because you're passionate as a leader of a business about your customers. You have your employees, of course, and you're even more passionate in many ways about your employees because that's where you're spending most of your time, and you want them to land in a great place with an acquisition. You have your investors, of course, who are hoping to get what they wanted out of the investment that they make, which is really financial and commercial success. And then, of course, you have just the mechanics of the integration. And so you have multiple stakeholders and you're balancing those needs, and they're not always aligned. And in fact, even within each stakeholder group I just mentioned, the interests aren't aligned. Some employees they might want to remain public and they're not, or they might want to remain private and separate and not be part of an acquisition. Others are really just looking for a career path in the acquired company. And others are actually looking, view it as an opportunity to transition out and go do something new. And so even within each stakeholder group, including even investors, you have investors who might have invested early on that might have a different expectation than those who just came in maybe in the last round of funding. And so it's balancing a lot of those interests. You can kind of never win in getting everyone happy, I'll tell you that. But it is really being focused on delivering the best outcome you can and getting it across the finish line, without hesitation. And meanwhile, by the way, you're doing all this while you're running the business, because as you may know, most acquisitions don't happen even if they're in the process of happening. They just don't get to the finish line. So you can't just completely, stop your day job and running the business while you're trying to sell the company. So I learned a lot, but it was a great experience. And I've been on, the acquiring side as well in my career, but it worked well. And I'll tell you that acquisition of Split by Harness went really well. I mean, the integration, I think it was partly because it was a really good strategic fit, but also because we put a lot of thought on both sides on how do you integrate the business well, and from everything from systems and processes and people and organizations, and it was a very thoughtful process, and I think that led to a good outcome after the acquisition.
Fantastic. So interesting to hear. I have one final question on career, and then I know Harry's got some questions more focused around talents and teams. But so someone who's looking to kind of emulate some of the success you've had across your career, is there anything personally that you would say stand out in terms of traits or common themes that have led to the success that you've experienced?
Hmm. Common themes that have led to this, just success. Yeah, there definitely are. I mean, some of these I maybe hit on already. I would say, staying close as a leader to the customer and the market. Really, it's interesting as companies scale. It's always remarkable how, early on you're always close to the market when you're a startup. Because that's just how the nature of the business. You're always talking to customers, assessing product market fit, and you stay very, very close. As you scale, as you bring in more people, many people don't actually touch customers. They don't touch the market, and I think you just have to find ways to make sure you stay close to customers. That's certainly one. The second one is one I talked about quite a bit already, which is just the importance of high performing teams, and that means teams with trust and being able to manage conflict and high accountability. They say what they're going to do and they do it. And people who also are collaborative and low ego. And I'd say, thirdly, advice I would give would be just to remain humble, right? I mean, you don't know everything. And, one of the things I enjoy most is just that opportunity to constantly learn. But you've got to have an element of humility and be open to feedback. And in some ways, as a CEO, you kind of have to seek out the feedback because you don't always you don't always get it unless you ask, to be honest with you. So I think those are some of the things I would say are common themes that other people should consider as they take on leadership roles.
Yeah, fantastic. Love some of those answers, Brian. I really appreciate you giving a bit of insight into your career so far. Definitely got some questions around talent and people and hiring for sure. I mean, the first one I wanted to ask was, how do you see the talent landscape today compared to earlier on in your career? How do you think it's changed?
Yeah, I think it has changed quite a bit, and I think it's going to change more, to be honest with you. I would say there's two things that strike me in how it's changed in the last, decade or so, which is it's certainly more global. I mean, we saw this happening, um, but it's really just, I mean, this global aspect of companies, even early stage at this stage, either early stage companies, growth stage company, which is where we are. They go global much faster, right? Even if they're not necessarily global in the markets they're in, which is also happening, they're certainly global in the talent pool, right? Especially in cybersecurity and infrastructure software, right? Great people can build world class careers and contribute from almost anywhere. It is important, I would say, as a leader to figure out how do you want that, where do you want the talent, and what kind of culture do you want to create? Because where you do have talent can influence the culture. But the other thing I would say that's changed, maybe this is a little bigger, is just that the way companies evaluate, the way candidates evaluate companies, I think is very different, right? Like there's a greater focus on the mission, right? Like what really are you trying to do? Um, and this is more important for some people than others, right? Like, is it something that resonates with them? Of course, that's important, but also, is it meaningful to them? And can they identify with that meaning? I think candidates look for more flexibility, certainly. They look for the importance of culture is very important. What people have learned, I think, very quickly that not all cultures are the same, and that life's short, and you want to work with a group of people and be in an environment that you're comfortable with. And then I think there's also a greater scrutiny of just the leadership than maybe in the past. What kind of leader is at the top, and what are the other leadership? How are the other leadership positions filled? I think those things have risen more in importance than things like compensation and role and some of the other aspects that have always been important.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I definitely agree. I think big candidates from the conversations we have are more and more interested in the mission and goal of the business and what impact it's making.
Yeah,
People want to be involved in something that's doing good or exciting at
yeah,
least. Um, Quick question: you've built and led teams across lots of companies. What do you look for when bringing in great talent, and maybe specifically with the startups? I think that's the most interesting one. Like, what do you
yeah.
look for in hiring, great talent at that earlier stage?
Yeah, I think the at the highest level for me, it really is kind of the mindset of the people you're bringing in. I think this is really important. It can be hard to evaluate, but there's two elements. I've been thinking about this lately because we're also kind of reviewing some of our corporate values, and this has come up because I think in this company it's really important, the mindset. And I think there's two dimensions that strike me. One is this idea of, being, inherently curious, right? Which is what drives innovation. And there's actually a Japanese phrase called Shoshin, which means like a beginner's mind. And I actually also got to give credit to Nick Mehta, who's the CEO. He was the CEO of Gainsight because he made this a corporate value, and I loved it. And of course, I have that connection to Japan. But this idea of just being curious, right, and always challenging what you see and not accepting it as the way it should be. I think that's really important. It's really important today with AI because it's rewriting the playbook of how companies are being built and how they run. The other dimension of mindset is this idea of a growth mindset, right? Which is really the belief that your abilities, your intelligence, your skills, they can be developed, right? Like it's not just who you are. You can actually very intentionally evolve through effort, through learning, through feedback, versus just believing that the way you are is sort of a fixed trait. You're looking for people who say, hey, I may not know how to do this, but I'm not afraid to jump in. I want to improve it with practice and with experience. And they see challenges as kind of opportunities. I think that's really, really important, particularly in this stage of company. The other thing that is always important to me is just high execution, right? I have grown much less patient with people who, don't actually deliver on what they say they're going to do, at least within the things they have control over, right? Really just get shit done, say what you're going to uh, do it. I often say to my team, not only say what you're going to do and do it, but then say you did it, right? People who and that what I mean by that last say, the say do say, the third word say means to go back and say, hey, I said I was going to do this, I did it, and I'm telling you I did it. And the reason that's important is because it builds credibility with yourself and with your teams and the people that you're working with. So I look for that. I look for this mindset piece, these two dimensions of mindset, and I look for just great execution.
Yeah, I mean it's brilliant answers. I mean, how do you know when you're ready to make that next senior leadership hire? Because that's a good
Yeah,
question that lots of businesses to and fro
yeah,
from of, how much revenue should we be making when we hire a CRO, or when do
yeah.
we hire our first marketing team? Like what's your take on when for those hires?
Well, they're all a little different, really. I mean, there are. I would say there's roughly some revenue numbers that I think do factor into when you build. But I often get asked those questions by other CEOs or other board members about that. When do you do it, and what profile do you look for at each stage? And there isn't really one answer. It really is, of course, dependent upon the context or the situation of the company. But I would say usually when you get to around you know 15 million is when you're 10 to 15 million of ARR, you really start to say, okay, do I have the team? I mean, you constantly have to be evaluating the team to say, do I have the right people in place? Because as we all know, the people that were great at in the early stages of the company may not be what you need as you scale, as you get to 10 or 15, 20 million. um, and also equally importantly, they may not want to do it anyway. I mean, a lot of people just really like being early on, and that's great. And often you have to help people realize that they're just not enjoying it, and often that they're not the right they don't have the right experience or the right skill set to be in the next phase. Sometimes you'll have people that want to be in the next phase. They're not the right person to lead that function, let's say, but they still want to be there. And you need to, I think, have a culture and a way in which you can bring in someone more senior on top of someone maybe who was originally leading that function, and keep them engaged and help them understand that it's an incredible growth opportunity for them to learn from the new leader you bring in. But I would say, to go back to your question specifically, when you get to around 10, 15 million, you start to look at leadership. The leadership you're bringing in a growth stage company, is a really interesting profile because, early on, you need versatile builders who can operate with ambiguity and roll up their sleeves. In a growth stage, you really need people who have this unique balance um, of not only people who can do the work, like they have to be scrappy, right? If you're going to hire a marketer, he or she needs to roll up their sleeves and do some of the event planning and writing the blog and doing that. They've got to be comfortable doing that, but you also need people who have seen the movie before, right? Like they know what scale looks like. So if you hire someone in this growth stage who's never seen what maybe a mature marketing organization looks like at $100 million, 100 million of revenue, or if you hire a sales leader that's never seen what an organization looks like at 100 million, you're not hiring the right person at the growth stage. They need to have that, mental model of what an organization operating at scale looks like, so they know where they're going.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's a really interesting one, and it kind of some people have got different perspectives on it, so it's great to hear your perspective
Yeah.
too. We've got some questions about FusionAuth and the customer identity access management space kind of coming up. I think I'd love to hear what drew you to FusionAuth when you first came across them as a business. What excited you about them?
Yeah, well, I mentioned earlier I had been in the identity space before. I left it when I was at my last company, but I was still very much in the application development space. I think what drew me to FusionAuth is first and foremost just the problem we solve, right? It's a real business problem. It is, as I talked about at the very beginning, it is about security, but it's also about business outcomes. And having a real business problem that is, increasingly important in the world we're in. As we are constantly interacting with digital experiences and with AI increasingly, and being able to securely manage those experiences and the identity of humans and non-humans and agents and machines is really, really important. Related to that is just the size of the market, right? It's a massive market. I'm a big believer that you can only really build big, great businesses in big markets, and this is a massive market and it's growing very well. FusionAuth, of course, the approach that FusionAuth takes also, of course, was what drew me to it, right? It is really, we have built a mission critical piece of infrastructure for identity that you can deploy anywhere. It's very much a developer first, API driven architecture. And it's predicated on this belief that customers really should control their identity infrastructure, being locked into like a black box SaaS model, which is what a lot of the other vendors in the market are doing. And then finally, I would say what drew me to FusionAuth is also just the unit economics. I've been around long enough to know what the elements of a good business look like financially and commercially, and this is a business that you know was really bootstrapped. It didn't take any venture funding for many years, and it was only 2 years ago where it took some money from private equity. But when you build and manage a business or grow a business that has been bootstrapped, it's a very, very healthy thing because you're very thoughtful about the decisions you make, and you're doing it in a way that's very mindful of, the financial model, which is at the end of the day what drives the valuation of companies. So that was
Yeah.
the fourth thing that really drew me to it.
I think that's interesting because it feels like a couple of years ago, people were really driven to opportunities where, 150 million funding round,
Yeah,
and the growth ambition is like that, and the expectation is like that, but also the way the business is hired can sometimes be in a bit of an irresponsible way, right? And
yeah,
and we've seen loads of businesses over the last 12 to 18 months had to lay off,
yeah.
10, 20, 30% of the workforce. So it's really good to hear how your model of growth at the business has been successful and the strong foundations it's built on. I think candidates and people find that more and more attractive as time goes
Yeah,
on.
often they don't realize, often they only come to recognize the value of that when they've had an experience where it didn't deliver what they thought, right? Either
Yeah.
they joined a company and overhired and there was restructuring, or the company got to some sort of exit, but no one made any anything out of it financially. And and so my advice to any candidate is you really got to look at the economics of the business and not just look at, oh, how much money was put into the business and what's the post money valuation, because often with a high post money valuation, the newer employees aren't going to make any money anyway, or very little. Yeah, if they're
Yeah.
coming in after that round, for sure.
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, and you spoke a bit more about the market. Obviously, transformation and AI are the two probably biggest, most spoken about words at all the shows that we're going to.
Yeah.
What opportunity do you see for FusionAuth in a market that is, growing and changing a little bit at the moment?
There's just huge opportunity. I mean, in the category in general, but certainly for FusionAuth specifically, I think one is a little bit more. There's some growth vectors that I think create a lot of opportunity for us. One of them, in fact, is Europe. We have well over a third of our business coming out of Europe in general, across Europe, including UK, Ireland, of course. Without any sales and marketing really that has been going on in the region, and so that creates an enormous opportunity if we actually invest and are thoughtful about how to scale in Europe. And also regulated industry is another one where we have good traction, but we've never really intentionally focused. We have some really interesting three-letter acronym agencies of the United States government that are using us, partly because we can deploy anywhere in air-gapped environments. We're sitting on satellites and we're sitting in military warehouses, et cetera, and other things like that. But we haven't really leaned into those regulated industries in an intentional way. I think the bigger thing that excites me about the opportunity, though, for FusionAuth is just the fact that identity is becoming more strategic because of what's happening with AI. I mean, AI agents are, they're happening, right? We're creating AI agents, and in this world of agents are essentially they're another thing that needs an identity, and they need to be tethered to some human in some way, and they need to be given the right permissions and authorizations. And the one of the critical pieces of infrastructure to secure this world of agentic AI is the identity infrastructure. And so that just creates a lot of opportunity, I think, for us. It's tailwinds in our business, and it's also just really exciting to be part of that transformation right now.
Yeah, no, interesting. And how do you see the customer identity access management space evolving broadly in the future? What kind of innovation do you think we're going to see?
Yeah, I think it's related to the last comment. It definitely is around AI, right? The next major shift is certainly non-human identity and delegated authorization for AI agents. You can, I mean, like we have, some great B2C retail customers, right? Now, if the people going into these retail customers are non-human agents who are placing pizza orders, right? Maybe with some permission from, someone built, some you know someone built like an agent that places their food orders every night for dinner.
Yeah,
That human has given these agents permissions. It said, hey, you can order pizza twice a week, but you can't spend more than this much when you order it, and you need to go to a different delivery company every time. You can create things like this fairly easily now on platforms like OpenClaw. What's the impact of that on AI, and how do vendors actually know, are these agents, are they humans? In many ways you can't distinguish today. And what's the implication of that on security and on potentially business outcomes if you don't manage it well? So that's certainly one. This AI wave is real. I mean, there's always, of course, in many ways a lot of overhype around it, but it's real. And then the other is just the ability to control your identity. You need to own it, right? I think the world in general got a little bit too enamored with some of these multi-tenant SaaS models, and they didn't appreciate, that you can be locked into it, that you don't have portability, that you're a shared infrastructure that creates inherent risk. And this idea that you need to control your identity and own it, I think is going to will continue to be an important part of the decision making in the category.
yeah. Are you more excited or wary about the AI's impact on the space? Because it feels like I hear.
On the space or on human society? Maybe that's another podcast. But On the space, I'm not weary about it all. I think it's actually, as I said earlier about my own career, what drives me, it is this like attraction to disruption and new ideas. And so for me, it's super exciting. I love that just thinking about, how the world is changing as a result of it, in all the ways it's changing. But certainly within this category, I'm not weary at all. I think it's actually a great growth opportunity, certainly for FusionAuth, as we figure it out. What do people need, and how do we play an important role in solving that problem?
Yeah, very exciting. Well, we have to move on to our final question, which, like the first, is always the same. What one piece of advice would you give to someone entering the cybersecurity industry today?
Yeah, well, I would say, the piece of advice I'd give is probably applies to any industry, honestly, and it's more of maybe a leadership piece of advice, which is, just don't assume that the old playbooks will work in today's world or tomorrow's world. I see this often. Sometimes I have to, challenge myself because you've done things in the past that have been successful or that, seem to be repeatable. But the world's changing. I think this AI trend is actually changing, the way companies are run and how they're being built, and how you run a marketing organization, how you run a sales organization. The bottlenecks that are in the processes and the systems are different. The skills that you need are different. The just there's great examples of that are just the SDR role, right? And it doesn't mean that this is about eliminating jobs. It's really thinking about how do they change, and how do you leverage the human talent to create, a fantastic business, going forward as the world is changing with some of this technology. So those old playbooks don't always apply, right? You have to kind of rethink them. You're still focused maybe on the same outcomes, but you have to maybe rethink how the work gets done and how the teams that you're building get built.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, brilliant advice for future leaders, but also, yeah, it's applicable to lots of different industries and seniorities as well. Thank you so much for joining us, Brian. Been really interesting hearing your insights. Thank you
Sure.
for joining
Great.
us.
Thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian.